Voicemail lasted 43 seconds. I know because I listened to it 11 times that night, standing in my kitchen in Oakville with the overhead light buzzing and my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. It was my grandson's voice. He was 6 years old and he whispered like he was afraid of being heard. "Grandma Flo, don't come for Thanksgiving. Daddy said something bad is going to happen to you at the cottage. He said it on the phone when he thought I was sleeping. Please don't come, Grandma Flo. That was 3 years ago. I am 67 years old now, retired from 31 years of nursing at Hamilton General, and I thought I had seen everything a person could see. I was wrong." Let me start where it actually started, because that voicemail didn't come from nowhere. My daughter Serena married a man named Griffin Holt 9 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I remember standing beside my husband Walter, watching her walk across the grass in her grandmother's dress, and thinking she had never looked so certain about anything in her life. Griffin was tall, well-spoken, a financial planner with a firm in downtown Toronto. He had that particular kind of charm that makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room whenever he looked at you. Walter liked him. My sister liked him. Everyone liked him. I was the only one who felt something I couldn't name sitting behind my sternum whenever he was around. Not dislike, exactly. Just a low-grade unease, like a smoke detector going off 3 floors away. Too faint to identify, too persistent to ignore. Walter passed from a sudden cardiac event 4 years into their marriage. My son-in-law handled everything beautifully. Organized the funeral home, coordinated with the insurance, made sure my grandsons, Felix was 3, little Owen just 8 months, were kept occupied at the reception while I sat in my good black dress and tried to remember how to breathe. Griffin was attentive and efficient and kind, and I told myself that the unease I'd always felt around him was grief making everything feel slightly wrong. After Walter died, I was alone in the house in Oakville. Griffin suggested more than once that I sell it. Too much space for one person, he'd say. Real estate values are at their peak, Flo. You could put the equity somewhere it actually works for you. I never said yes, but I never pushed back hard either. He managed Serena's finances, had her power of attorney, and she trusted him the way you trust someone you've built a life with. I understood that. What I didn't understand, not yet, was that he had begun working on me 18 months before Felix left that voicemail. It started small, a new tea blend he brought over one Sunday. He'd found it at a shop on Queen Street, he said, and thought I might enjoy it since I'd always had trouble sleeping after Walter died. It was in a plain brown paper bag, loose leaf, no label. I thought it was thoughtful. I brewed it that night and slept for 11 hours. I thought I was just finally resting. I thought grief was finally letting go. The Sunday teas became a ritual. He always brought the blend, always prepared it himself when he visited. I started struggling to concentrate during the week. I put it down to age, to living alone too long, to the particular fog of long-term grief. My doctor ran blood work and found nothing alarming. I stopped driving to my Thursday book club in Mississauga because by 7 in the evening I couldn't keep my eyes open. I started declining invitations. I stopped calling my sister as often. The world shrank and I let it shrink because I was tired in a way I had never been tired before. And I thought that was just what 65 felt like when you were doing it alone. Then came August of last year. My daughter called me on a Wednesday to confirm the Thanksgiving plans. We did it every year at Griffin's family cottage near Haliburton, a beautiful old property on a lake 2 hours north of the city, surrounded by maple and birch that turned gold and red by the long weekend. I'd been going for 6 years. I looked forward to it. The boys loved the canoe, the fire pit, the way the lake looked at dawn when the mist sat low over the water. But that Wednesday, Serena sounded off. Flat somehow, like she was reading from notes. "We're still planning for Saturday," she said. "Griffin wants it to be just us this year. The boys, you, us, No extended family. He thinks we all need some time to reconnect. I said of course, and I meant it. I had no reason not to. 4 days later, Felix left the voicemail. I sat down on the kitchen floor after the 11th listen, not because I couldn't stand, but because the floor felt like the only honest thing in the room. My grandson was 6 years old, and he had whispered, "Don't come, Grandma Flo," and I had spent 18 months so sedated I hadn't noticed anything was wrong. I called my sister Constance that same night. She is 71 and sharp as a blade, and she has never liked Griffin, not from the vineyard ceremony, not once. I had always chalked it up to her general suspicion of men who were too polished. I didn't chalk it up to that anymore. Constance came to Oakville the next morning. I played her the voicemail. We sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea I had made myself, and she listened, and then she said very quietly, "Florence, stop drinking that tea he brings you, tonight. Don't touch it again." I hadn't even considered that. I had been so inside the fog that I hadn't looked at it from the outside. I poured the remaining dried leaves down the bathroom sink and flushed it twice. Within 4 days, I was sleeping normally. Within a week, I could read for 3 hours without losing the thread. Within 10 days, I felt like myself for the first time in over a year. That was when the fear truly arrived. Because feeling like myself again meant understanding clearly what had been done to me and what might have been building toward. Constance had a friend from her years as a paralegal, a man named Bernard Okafor, who had left a Bay Street firm to do private investigative work. She called in a favor. Bernard was thorough, quiet, and methodical. And what he found over the following 2 weeks rearranged everything I thought I knew. Griffin had taken out a life insurance policy on me 14 months prior. $2 million. He was listed as secondary beneficiary after Serena. Bernard found the application through a contact at the Provincial Insurance Registry. The policy had been active long enough that a payout would raise no automatic flags. He had also, over the past 2 years, moved a significant portion of Serena's joint assets into accounts she did not have direct access to. Not illegally, not exactly, but structured in a way that would be very difficult to untangle if something happened to disrupt the marriage. Serena had signed documents she described to me in passing as routine paperwork. She trusted him to handle the details. And then Bernard found the other address. A leased condo in Etobicoke, registered to a corporate holding company with Griffin's initials buried in the chain of ownership. A woman named Delia Voss had been living there for 26 months. Bernard was careful with what he shared, but he confirmed she existed, that she had been in regular contact with Griffin, and that she had recently gone on parental leave from her position at a marketing firm. I sat with that information for 1 full day before I could speak again. Griffin wasn't just trying to remove me from the picture. I was a complication he had been managing for over a year. My house in Oakville had been assessed at $2.1 million in the spring. I had no other children. My will left everything to Serena. If I died before I had any reason to change that, and if something were then to happen to the marriage, Griffin had already structured things so that the money would flow in a direction Serena might not even see clearly until it was too late. I am a nurse. I have sat with people who are dying. I understand the difference between someone leaving this world and someone being taken from it. I understood then that I had been being moved toward a door. I called Bernard back. I told him I wanted to do what I had to do with evidence, not suspicion. The Thanksgiving plan was still on. Griffin had confirmed it by text to Serena. Saturday, the long weekend, the cottage near Halliburton. Remote property. Serena couldn't swim well. Neither could I, not really, not in cold open water. That detail had come up more than once over the years. I remembered Griffin suggesting swimming lessons for me once. The way you suggest something to someone you've mentally filed away is vulnerable. I told Bernard I was going to go. He looked at me the way my residents used to look at me when I had to tell them something difficult. "Florence," he said, You understand what you're describing. I understand exactly what I'm describing, I said, and I need it to be airtight. We had 6 days. Bernard contacted a detective with the OPP he trusted, a woman named Detective LaRoche, who worked out of the Barry detachment. She was careful and skeptical in the right proportions. She reviewed what Bernard had gathered and agreed there was enough to justify surveillance, but not enough yet to arrest. We need him to move, she told us. We need him to act. I wore a device taped below my collarbone. Waterproof, Bernard confirmed, showing me the specifications on his laptop. He tested it 3 times. I am a former nurse. I can manage discomfort without changing my expression. On the Friday before Thanksgiving, Griffin arrived at my door in Oakville to drive me up to Halliburton. He was warm and attentive. He carried my bag to the car. He asked about my health. The fog, I told him. Still not sleeping great. He patted my hand across the center console and said the fresh air would do me good. I looked out the passenger window at the 400 North and thought about my grandsons and kept my breathing even. Serena was already at the cottage when we arrived. She looked tired in a way that had become familiar over the past year, a kind of careful tiredness, as if she'd been managing something she hadn't told me about. She hugged me at the door and held on a little too long. Owen ran into my legs and I picked him up and pressed my face into his hair and stayed there until I was sure I was steady. That night, Griffin brought me a mug of tea after dinner. Just chamomile, he said, from the grocery store. Nothing special. I looked at the tag on the bag still steeping in the mug and thanked him, and waited until he left the kitchen to pour it down the drain. Saturday morning. Thanksgiving. Saturday. Cold and bright, the kind of Ontario fall that looks like a painting. The birches lit up gold against a flat gray sky. Griffin suggested we take the canoe out. He said it was warm enough with the sun. He said the boys could watch from the dock. He said Serena was tired and was going to rest inside. I said that sounded lovely. I knew the lake was deep. I knew the temperature of water in Halliburton County in October. I had done my research. I had also, the week prior, spent 2 mornings with Constance at the community pool in Burlington, relearning how to float and how to hold my breath. I was 66 years old, and I was not going to go into that water unprepared. We paddled out together in the aluminum canoe. Griffin paddled from the back. He was relaxed, talkative. He pointed out a great blue heron standing motionless in the shallows along the far shore. He asked me about Walter, about what our early years had been like, the way you ask someone about things you want to seem interested in. I kept the recording going. I answered his questions. I let him talk. And then he said, very casually, while he was looking at the heron, "You know, Flo, I've been thinking about your estate planning. Serena worries. We both do. You've got that house sitting there and no real structure around it. If something happened to you, it would be complicated for her." I said, "I've been meaning to talk to a lawyer about it." He said I should let him help. He said he'd already spoken to someone. He said it could all be handled cleanly. I said, "Does Serena know you've been planning this?" There was a pause, a short one, but I had been a nurse for 31 years, and I had learned to read the pauses between words, the way you read a patient's chart. He moved then. Not violently. Almost gently. He shifted his weight in the canoe, and it tilted, and I went into the water before I had fully registered that it was happening. The cold was extraordinary. October cold in the Canadian Shield. It drove every thought out of my head for one long second. Then I remembered Constance in the pool. Hold still. Don't fight it. Let the water decide you're not a threat. I heard the canoe scraping above me. I heard nothing else. I surfaced on the far side of the canoe as quietly as I could. I grabbed the hull and held on and breathed in small, shallow sips and did not make a sound. Griffin was on his phone. He was speaking in the even, unhurried tone of a man who has rehearsed this. "I already told you it was an accident. She leaned over to see something in the water and the canoe tipped. I tried. I couldn't reach her in time. He paused, and then quieter. Yes, we can move on the accounts by Wednesday. I heard the OPP boat before I saw it. Detective LaRoche and 2 officers came around the south point of the lake at speed. Bernard was in a second boat behind them. I pulled myself along the hull and got my arm over the side and held on while the officers shouted at Griffin to put the phone down and put his hands where they could be seen. He looked at me in the water, and I looked back at him. He didn't say anything. His face did what I had always seen in that face. Underneath the warmth, the polish, the attentiveness. It calculated. It assessed. It found no usable angle. They helped me out of the water with a thermal blanket and a steadiness I was grateful for. I was shaking so hard my teeth knocked together, but I was standing on the dock of that cottage in Halliburton County, and I was alive. Detective LaRoche put her hand briefly on my shoulder. "We got it," she said. "All of it." Serena came out of the cottage when she heard the commotion. She stood on the porch steps with her arms crossed over herself, looking at the dock, looking at her husband in handcuffs, and something in her face moved the way ice moves when a river starts to thaw. Not all at once, just a crack, and then another. I went to her, and she held on to me, and the boys stood behind her pressing their faces against the backs of her legs, and I could feel Felix, 6 years old, trembling, and I said into his hair, "I listened to you, sweetheart. I heard you." The charges were laid that same weekend: attempted murder, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty related to Serena's accounts. The wire recording had caught his words on the lake and his phone call after. Bernard's documentation gave the financial picture. Serena's testimony about the account restructuring gave the pattern. Griffin's lawyer argued that the canoe tipped accidentally, that his phone call was shock and poor judgment, that nothing he had said constituted a confession. The Crown went through it carefully, detail by detail. The insurance policy. The timing of the account transfers. Delia Voss, who testified that Griffin had told her on multiple occasions that he was handling a complicated family situation and that things would be resolved by the new year. The tea leaves that had been retrieved from my bathroom drain and sent to a lab by Bernard 2 weeks before the cottage weekend, which came back positive for trace quantities of a sedative compound. The jury took less than a day. Griffin Holt was sentenced to 19 years. He will be eligible for parole review in 12, which means he will be in his late 50s when he walks out, if he does. I received a victim notification letter from the Correctional Service of Canada with the details. I read it on my porch in Oakville with a cup of tea I made myself, loose leaf from a tin I bought at the St. Jacobs Farmers Market. And I noted the information and set the letter down and watched the neighbor's dog amble across my front lawn and thought about how ordinary that was, how unremarkable and how entirely wonderful. Serena spent 2 years untangling the financial arrangements Griffin had put in place. She had a good lawyer and Constance's help, and a fierce, determined focus I recognized from when she was a child who wanted something and had decided she was going to get it. She recovered most of what had been moved. Not all of it, but most. She has a small apartment in Burlington now, close enough that the boys can walk to my house after school on Tuesdays, which they do. Felix is 9. He's quiet. In the way he's always been quiet, observant, careful with his words. He started a drawing journal last year, his own idea. And sometimes he shows me what's in it, and sometimes he doesn't, and I think that's right and appropriate. He knows what he did. He doesn't make a big thing of it. Neither do I, because I don't want it to be a weight he carries. But on the anniversary of that Thanksgiving weekend, I baked his favorite lemon loaf and wrote him a small card that said, "You were 6 years old, and you were braver than anyone," and he read it and folded it in half and put it in his jacket pocket, and that was all we needed to say. Delia Voss, for what it's worth, had not known about me, had not known about the insurance policy, had not known about Serena's accounts. She had known he was married but had believed his marriage had been over for years. She moved away after the trial. I have thought about her occasionally with something more complicated than I expected. We were both kept in the dark by the same person, just in different rooms. I sold the house in Oakville last spring, not because Griffin had suggested it years ago, but because I was ready, and because the market suited me, and because I found a small property in Elora with a kitchen garden and a creek at the back of the lot, and I wanted that more than I wanted to stay in the house where I had learned to be afraid. I planted tomatoes in May and they came in better than I expected. I turned 67 in July. Constance came from Guelph and we sat in the garden with gin and tonics, and the yellow dog from the house, 2 doors down, who has decided I belong to her. And we didn't talk about Griffin, or the cottage, or any of it, because we didn't need to. We talked about the tomatoes and whether the creek floods in spring and which library branch in Fergus has the better selection of large print mysteries. I still think about the tea, about the months I spent inside that fog, declining invitations, shortening my world, believing I was simply aging badly. A nurse. 31 years reading symptoms in other people, and I had missed every one of my own. I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because it's useful to know. The people who want to make you small are rarely loud about it. They bring you tea. They manage your paperwork. They say the fresh air will do you good. If something feels like it's slowly becoming less of you, pay attention to that. I know that sounds obvious from the outside. It didn't look obvious from the inside. And if a child tells you something frightening about someone you love, stop what you're doing. Put down whatever's in your hands. Get down to their level and listen like it's the most important thing you'll hear that day, because it might be. Felix was 6 years old and he whispered into a phone in the dark, and it was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed. I am alive in Elora in a house with a garden and a creek and a dog that isn't mine, and I have Constance and I have Serena. And I have 2 grandsons who come for lemon loaf on Tuesdays, and I have the ordinary morning light, which I no longer take for granted, not for a single day. I think about the tea a lot, not with anger anymore, just with a kind of quiet attention, the way you look at a scar that's finished hurting. Someone handed me something that looked like kindness, and I took it without question because I trusted the hand that was offering it. That's not stupidity. That's what happens when you let your guard down around someone who has studied where your guard is weakest. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that actions tend to complete themselves. Griffin had built something careful and dishonest over years, and that kind of structure doesn't hold. Not because the universe punishes bad people in any tidy or mystical way, but because deception is genuinely hard to sustain. It requires constant maintenance. It requires everyone around you to stay exactly as uninformed as you need them to be. The moment one person starts seeing clearly, the whole architecture becomes fragile. In my case, that person was 6 years old and sleeping in a cottage bedroom when he wasn't supposed to be awake. Felix didn't have the vocabulary to explain what he sensed. He just had the instinct to act on it, and the courage to pick up a phone and call me, even though he didn't fully understand what he was warning me about. That kind of moral clarity in a child doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from being raised in a home where honesty was practiced, where his feelings were taken seriously, where he understood that speaking up about something frightening was the right thing to do even when it was scary. Serena gave him that. Whatever else Griffin had taken from her, he hadn't taken that. I spent 31 years as a nurse reading other people's symptoms. I missed every one of my own. That still sits with me. But what I've come to understand is that intelligence isn't only about what you know. It's about being willing to question what you've been given, to look at the source of something rather than just accepting the shape of it. I accepted the tea because I accepted the person. When Constance said stop, I stopped. That was the most important decision I made in this entire story, and it cost me nothing except the willingness to admit I might have been wrong about someone. The resilience part came later. Getting in that canoe, sitting in October lake water while my teeth knocked together and the boats came around the point. That took something I didn't know I still had at 66. But I think we underestimate ourselves in that particular way, especially when we've been made smaller gradually, degree by degree. The fog Griffin had kept me in wasn't just physical, it was a slow erosion of believing I was capable. When it cleared, I found out I still was. I'm not who I was before that Thanksgiving. I don't think I'm meant to be. I have a garden in Elora, and a creek at the back, and a dog that belongs to someone else and comes to see me anyway. And I have Felix on Tuesdays with his lemon loaf, and I have the very plain and very sufficient knowledge that I am still here. That's enough. That has always been enough.